Okay, so, sometimes you stumble across something and it's like, wow, where do I even begin with
I
this?
know exactly what you mean.
Today's deep dive is going to be one of those. We're looking at this, let's call it a unique piece of writing.
That's putting it mildly.
It's called Degrees of Jewishness, and it's something else.
Right off the bat, what's striking is how the author tries to define Jewishness,
Not-
not just as like religion or ethnicity, but as this almost, I don't know, spiritual force or something.
They see it everywhere, influencing everything, and they've got these categories, these degrees to explain it all.
Which is where things get really interesting, to say the least.
So they start with this degree 1, insular and traditional, and honestly kind of reads like a list of stereotypes you might find somewhere.
Oh, absolutely. It's like they took the most common perceptions of Jewish communities and just kind of ran with it.
Yeah, like this image of a group that's super focused on their faith, very traditional, and like intentionally separate from everyone else.
And that's something we always have to be cautious of, right? This idea of taking one group's experience and presenting it as if it represents everyone.
For sure. It's a huge generalization.
It is.
Hmm.
Because within any community, especially one as diverse as the Jewish community, you're going to have a whole spectrum of beliefs, practices, all of it.
Okay, so then it gets even more, I don't know, provocative with degree 2, the subversive influence. This is where they suggest that it's actually ethnically Jewish people who don't strictly practice the religion who are the ones most likely to challenge, like, societal norms.
Yeah, and that idea of a minority group kind of pushing in the boundaries, questioning things,
Yeah.
it's not new. You see it throughout history.
That's a good point. It's like they're coming from a different perspective.
Exactly. And that can lead to really interesting, sometimes disruptive changes.
Oh.
Because when you're not part of the dominant group, you see things differently. You notice the cracks in the system.
So, okay, then they go on to degree 3. When Gentiles catch Jewishness, this is where things got really out there.
Because now they're saying that even non-Jewish people can embody this Jewishness by adopting certain mindsets or behaviors.
Yeah, they point to things like, media consumption and cultural shifts as examples. Like, it's this whole media is corrupting us kind of thing.
It's interesting, right? Because this fear of ideas spreading, of cultures influencing each other, it's a tale as old as time.
It's like this deep-seated anxiety about what happens when different groups interact. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And the way the author frames it with his language of catching Jewishness, it almost implies this, like, contagious element.
It's kind of unsettling, honestly.
It is, because it plays into these age-old fears about the other, about the unknown, and it raises all sorts of questions about how we view the flow of ideas, how we understand cultural exchange.
And just when you think they can't get any more out there, they hit you with degree 4, the transcendent Jew.
Which is really where you start to see the author's own personal views, I think.
Totally. They're basically saying that certain Jewish people have, in their view, moved beyond, like, the negative aspects of Jewishness.
Right. And they use examples like, St. Paul and some modern-day figures who've converted to Christianity. It's this very specific lens they're looking through.
And that whole idea of transcending one's heritage, it's a lot to unpack.
It is.
Yeah.
Because embedded in that is this assumption that there's a hierarchy, a right and a wrong way to be Jewish.
And that's just not how identity works, right?
Exactly. People's experiences are far too complex and nuanced to be put into these neat little boxes.
Totally. But what really struck me, even beyond the content itself, was the language they use. Like, it's very deliberate.
Absolutely. The language is crucial to understanding the potential impact of this kind of argument. For instance, at one point, they actually compared Jewishness to a disease.
Yeah, and I know they try to soften it later, saying it doesn't justify harm or anything, but that kind of comparison, it sticks with you.
It does. Because it reveals a lot about how the author views this entire topic. Like, they're viewing it through this very specific and frankly unsettling lens. And then there's their use of the term shaboskoi.
Yeah, that one jumped out at me too.
For those unfamiliar, it refers to a non-Jewish person who performs tasks for Jewish people on the Sabbath. But it's a term loaded with historical baggage, often used in the context of anti-Semitic stereotypes.
Right, so it's like, even though they're trying to sound somewhat objective, you can't ignore the way they're using these loaded terms. It's definitely intentional.
It is, and it speaks to a larger pattern within the author's argument, this tendency to reduce entire groups of people down to these essentialized categories that ultimately don't hold up under scrutiny.
And we can't just gloss over that because these kinds of stereotypes, these generalizations, they have real-world consequences.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We've seen throughout history how these kinds of ideas, rooted in prejudice and misinformation,
Mm.
can be used to justify discrimination and even violence.
And that's why we're taking the time to really unpack this, because it's not just about dissecting the content of this one source. It's about understanding how these kinds of narratives, even if they seem outlandish, can take root and spread if we're not careful.
Precisely. It's about encouraging critical thinking, about equipping our listeners with the tools to identify these harmful ideas and challenge them.
Because ultimately, silence or indifference, that's
Yeah,
how these things fester and grow. It's by having these conversations, even the uncomfortable ones, that we can start to dismantle these harmful narratives.
I completely agree. It's about fostering understanding, promoting empathy,
Uh-huh.
and recognizing the humanity of all people, regardless of their background or beliefs.
So as we delve deeper into this source, let's keep that in mind because we're not just analyzing words on a page here. We're grappling with ideas that have real-world weight, ideas that have the power to shape perceptions and influence how we interact with each other.
And that's a responsibility we all share. To be aware of the power of language, to challenge harmful stereotypes, and to promote a more just and equitable world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
It's like they're taking this incredibly complex history of interactions between different groups and just, I don't know, simplifying it to the point where it loses all meaning.
Exactly. It's reducing these relationships down to these transactional terms, which completely misses the nuance of the situation.
And it's especially concerning when you remember the historical context, right? Like these kinds of stereotypes and generalizations, they've been used to justify some pretty awful things.
Absolutely. You can't ignore the long history of anti-Semitism, which often relied on these very same tropes and distortions that we're seeing in this text.
Right, like it's not coming from nowhere. These ideas have roots.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be aware of the language being used, to
Yeah.
really dissect the assumptions behind the words.
It's like we can't just read this stuff passively. We have to be actively thinking about what's being said, how it's being said, and why.
I completely agree. It's about fostering critical thinking, about giving our listeners the tools they need to engage with these ideas in a nuanced and informed way.
Because it's so easy to just hear something and accept it at face value, especially if it confirms some biases we might already have.
It is, but it's in those moments when we're confronted with something that challenges our worldview that real learning can happen.
Okay, so speaking of challenging worldviews, there's another aspect of the author's argument that I want to unpack a little bit, their perspective on conversion to Christianity.
Ah, yes. This ties directly back into their concept of transcendence, doesn't it?
Exactly. It's like they're suggesting that converting to Christianity is the only way for a Jewish person to truly escape what they see as the negative aspects of their heritage.
Which, again, reveals a very specific and limited perspective.
Totally. It's as if they're saying that other paths, like, I don't know, secularism or even just a less strict interpretation of Judaism, those aren't valid options.
Right, because it assumes that there's one right way to navigate one's identity, which is simply not true.
Yeah, it's way more complicated than that. And this whole idea of transcendence, of leaving one's heritage behind, it's a concept that's been debated for centuries.
It has, and it raises some fundamental questions about what it means to belong, about the relationship between individuals and their communities.
Exactly. Like, can you ever truly separate yourself from your background, from the experiences that have shaped who you are? It's a question without easy answers.
It is, and it brings us back to a central issue with the author's argument. This tendency to essentialize complex phenomena, to present individual perspectives as universal truths.
Right, like they're trying to create a one-size-fits-all explanation for something that's incredibly nuanced and multifaceted.
Exactly. And that kind of thinking is not only reductive, it can be incredibly dangerous.
It's like they're looking at this vast tapestry of human existence and trying to convince us that it's just a single color, a single thread.
When in reality, it's an incredibly intricate and interconnected web of experiences, perspectives, and beliefs.
And that's just not the way the world works, right?
Exactly. It's like they're handing us this puzzle, but half the pieces are missing. And they're saying, see, it all makes sense now.
But it doesn't. If anything, it just raises more questions.
It does, and that's where critical thinking comes in, being willing to question what you read, what you hear, looking for those missing pieces.
Because even though, let's be honest, the source material is a bit out there. It does make you think, right?
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
like holding up this, like, distorted mirror to society. The reflection might be messed up, but it still shows you something.
It makes you think about how we see ourselves, how we see other people, the power of ideas, even when those ideas are, questionable.
Precisely. Because ideas, even those rooted in bias or prejudice, have power. They can shape how we perceive the world, how we treat each other.
And that's a heavy thought. It's a lot of responsibility recognizing that.
It is. It's not enough to just dismiss these kinds of narratives as, like, fringe or whatever. We have to actively engage with them, unpack them, and challenge them.
Because, like we were saying before, silence just lets these things grow in the dark.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
in those uncomfortable conversations where we're forced to confront different viewpoints that real growth can happen.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm kind of left with this question, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it too. Like, if Jewishness, as this author defines it, is this, powerful force, what does that even mean for how we think about culture, identity, all of it?
That's a big question, and I don't think there's a simple answer.
Right. Like, how much of who we are is shaped by the groups we belong to? How much is individual? It's complicated.
It is, but it's a conversation worth having because how we choose to define ourselves, how we choose to see each other, it has real-world implications.
And on that note, we're going to leave you all with that to ponder. We don't have all the answers, but hopefully this deep dive has given you some things to think about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And encouraged you to keep asking questions.
Because at the end of the day, it's about understanding, it's about empathy, it's about recognizing the humanity in everyone.
Well said.
That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.